First, I want to thank all of you for coming tonight, especially those who came in person to see this very, very important discussion. This is a very significant day. October 16th, 1943 was the day that the Nazi invaders rounded up the Jewish prisoners in Rome. And this is 80 years ago today. And so we are very, very happy to bring up evidence. We have now newly found evidence of the actions that were taken by Pope Pius XII directly and the Vatican to save Jewish lives during the Holocaust. First, I want to thank my very good friend, Monsignor Frank Caldwell, and his logistical staff for helping us set up here at the Curia of Ars. Also, our director, Pave director, Vincent Levian, and the DeSalles Media, who are setting up all of the cameras and all the other things, and of course, our board of directors for Pave Foundation. I'm going to sort of begin this by setting forth a little reality that we have a situation. We call them the historical revisionists. There's a certain reality about these people. The people who are currently the critics of this particular period, none of them, not one of them, have ever served their country in the military. So they have literally no knowledge. They have no life experience of the covert actions you have to take, the deception that you need to take in military tactics. They also, none of them, have ever lived through the horrors of the Nazi regime. So they can read all the books you want about it, but unless you're actually there losing your fingernails, scraping a garbage pail to get something to eat, or hiding in a cesspool to avoid capture, you really don't know. And so judgments that people have made, and there are many of them, are based on their life experience, and these people simply don't have it. And so this is the problem, because I'll tell you the reason I'm mentioning this. If you have asked the question very, very simply, why did every rabbi, chief rabbi on earth, every Jewish organization on earth, every single special, Jewish personalities, Albert Einstein, Goldman, everybody praised Pius XII unreservedly, and did so up until 5 years after he died. These are all the people that lived through the war and experienced what was happening in Europe at the time. And all of the eyewitnesses that we have, exactly the same thing. And then 5 years after Pacelli died in 1958, the whole world changed. A 180-degree turn without one smoking gun. This is a very curious thing, but the fact is, this was the errors that have been made, and unfortunately, the Catholic Church and Pope Pius XII suffered from this. In fact, I call it the worst character assassination of the 20th century, but we know what happened. And if anybody is interested, you simply have to go online and Google Moscow's assault on the Vatican, and you'll read the entire story about how the Soviet KGB went about destroying the reputation of Pius XII and destroying the reputation of the Catholic Church. And this is a crime in Judaism. Why? Because in the Jewish faith, the worst character flaw you can have is ingratitude. And what the KGB did, because of this action, robbed the Jewish people of the dignity of showing gratitude to one of the only men in all occupied Europe that did anything to save them, and saved almost 1 million Jewish lives during the Second World War, which is today 25% of the entire world's Jewish population. There are only 16.5 million Jews in the entire world today. There's 1.2 billion Catholics, 1.1 billion other Christian denominations, but only 16 million Jews, 1.4 billion Muslims. So it's 0.2% of the world's population, and 50% of the Jewish population was wiped out by the Nazi regime. And Pope Pius XII was one of the only leaders who actively served to save as many Jewish lives as he could, and he did successfully. And so we're going to discuss some things tonight, I think, which is really important. There's also another fact that Dr. X just came in from Rome. They had a special conference at the Gregorian University on the newly found documents. And I find that sort of strange. And the reason is that when Pave the Way started researching this project, we found tens of thousands of documents that have been available since the end of World War II that literally nobody has bothered to research. Literally every community, every Catholic community, every parish has archives. And if you go to any one of them and you go in, you can actually find wartime documents there. So you're talking about tens of thousands of documents that have been available since the end of World War II, which none of these revisionists have ever bothered to look at. And so it's been a very, very, it's a bit disturbing, but this is what's happening. And the world believes everything that they say, but that solid wall is cracking now, because now truth is coming out. So the whole notion that they have to go to the apostolic archives to find out the information is nonsense. So what are there, 6 archives, Vatican archives? About, and literally nobody's really examined this issue, and that's why it's a very disturbing thing. And so what I'd like to do tonight is we're going to allow, first I want Princess Georgia Pacelli is the grand niece of Pope Pius XII and the granddaughter of the head of the Palatine Guard, which was very active during the war, and we're going to let Princess Pacelli talk about her family and some of this information.
So, good evening. I'm very glad and honored to be here with you, and I would like to share with you for a few moments, some souvenirs of my family. In the context of the work carried out by the Holy See, its effort to save as many of those persecuted by the Nazis as possible, I would like to present the little-known story of the work of the Palatine Guards in the service of the Pope, who for 33 years were under the command of my grandfather, Count Francesco Cantuti Castelvetri, including the years of the World War II. My grandfather was born in 1904 to a noble family in Modena. He graduated first in law and then in economics, and became a university lecturer at the Faculty of Economics at the Sapienza University of Rome. At the age of 22, in 1927, he joined the Papal Noble Guard. In 1930, he married the daughter of Senator Natale Prampolini, and they would have 8 children. It has been the first marriage to be celebrated in the Vatican after the 1929 Concordat between Italy and the Holy See, and the celebration took place in the chapel of the Palatine Guards. In 1935, he was sent to a mission to Paris to the Apostolic Nuncio Luigi Maglione. And the first photo, have you seen the first photo? In 1935, he was sent on a mission to Paris to the Apostolic Nuncio Luigi Maglione. This underscores already his close ties with Eugenio Pacelli. In fact, Maglione would become his Secretary of State. Next photo. In November 1937, he was appointed commander of the Palatine Guard of Honor by Pius XI. Next photo. He will remain in command of the Guard for 33 years until the dissolution of the Corps in 1970. The Palatine Guard, founded in 1849, after 1870, remained a merely representative militia responsible for safeguarding papal territory in Rome. The Corps membership card guaranteed their safety as a soldier of an armed corps of a neutral nation, and during the war, the partisans who were aware of this immunity had produced for themselves false member cards in which appeared the forged signature of the commander of the corps, namely Francesco Cantuti Castelvetri. It therefore happened that my grandfather, as commander of the Palatine Guard, was often convoked at night to the notorious Roman prison in Via Tasso, recognize or less the identification of people as belonging to the contingent he commanded. He invariably recognized all of those who held a false card in order to save their lives, even at the risk of his own. And my mother and her sisters and brothers, all of them remember very well how our grandmother, very worried, gathered all of them during the night to pray together the rosary until my grandfather would not be returned at home. In fact, torture was not foreign to the Nazi prison practices in Via Tasso, and if the prisoner would have already confessed his extraneousness to the papal militia, for the commander there would undoubtedly have been very serious repercussions. The courage shown during these circumstances earned him, after World War II, a solemn recommendation from the Allied military command of the city of Rome. The Vatican, also through enlistment in the ranks of the Papal Guard, provided protection to members of all political alignments and religious beliefs. In October 1943, in addition to the Gendarmerie and the Swiss Guard, there was also the Palatine Guard. To protect the Vatican and the extraterritorial establishments, there were normally 575 Palatine Guards. Well, in 1943, the Holy See asked Italian permission to enroll an additional number of people, reaching the total number of 1,425 recruits of the Palatine Guards. Can we see the photo of the next photo, please? As a neutral, non-belligerent state, the work of the Pope during the war had been carried out on basically two tracks, the diplomatic one and the one of silent resistance. The extraterritorial palaces and basilicas had become asylum for political refugees. Among them, there were ministers, prominent members of the opposition, and large numbers of Jews. Numerous are the actions we know of. I would like to tell, as an example, the episode reported by the famous Italian film director Vittorio De Sica, and that family members do remember to have been told. De Sica himself had occasion to recount his experience. The protagonists of this story were Vittorio De Sica and Monsignor Montini, then the substitute of the Secretariat of State of Pius XII. The story took place in Rome while the Germans occupied the city, and it goes like this. The Catholic Film Center had financed the producer Salvo D'Angelo to shoot the film The Gate of Heaven. This film was to tell the story of the pilgrimage of hospital train to the shrine of Loreto, and the director chosen was Vittorio De Sica, the father of the neorealist cinema. All this, as you can imagine, was a very risky undertaking, and it was followed up directly by the Holy See through the indispensable involvement of Monsignor Montini. The shooting of the film began in March 1944, and the location chosen was the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls, as it was Vatican extraterritorial territory secured by the Palatine Guard. There, scenes of both the famous Marian Shrine and the train transporting the sick were filmed. The whole film, however, was a farce to be kept up indefinitely. De Sica often even pretended to film. The film was never finished, but it did not matter. In fact, it was quite another purpose in which the Vatican was actively involved. De Sica, skillful, often shot either with the expired film or even without it. He did everything he could to slow down the filming, succeeding in a rocambolic way to prolong the making of the film until the arrival of the Allies. De Sica used for the film technicians and workers who were in reality draft doggers. He hired an enormous number of extra personnel he had no need for, about 300, including Jews. De Sica found himself facing Germans who wanted to enter the set and managed to stop them with all the motives he was able to invent. So the film was literally stretched until Rome was liberated and everyone present on the set was saved. Of this miracle, only 88 minutes of film remained. This story in itself is incredible, but it has it even more if one considers that just a month earlier, on February 3, 1944, the entire complex of the Benedictine Abbey of St. Paul outside the walls was violently raided by 100 or so plainclothes Italian policemen under Nazi command. On that night, the Palatine Guard, present in defense of the Abbey and the people hidden there, including many Jews, were all taken hostage. The Palatine Guard, its weapons were confiscated and they were bound and locked up. Details of this raid can be read in Johann Hick's book, The Pope's Cabinet. We learn from the official reports that many Jews were also hidden under religious garb. Surprising is the courage and risk with which only a few weeks later, the Holy See reopened the doors of the San Paolo outside the walls for those in need. A few weeks later, March 1st, another extraterritorial border trespassing by the Nazis took place. This time in the Basilica di Santa Maria Maggiore. Here, the Palatine Guard, without real acts of violence or deployment of forces, however, reacted instantly. Another testimony confirms the concrete help given by the Vatican to the Jews at the time of the World War II. It refers in particular to a certain Bruno Ascoli, one of those 1,425 people enrolled into the Palatine Guard. I quote the words of Silvio Ascoli, Bruno's sons. My father was born in 1910. His ancestors belonged to the Jewish community in Ancona, and his sister, together with her husband, would have been deported and killed in Auschwitz. Bruno, who died in 1970, was the child of a mixed marriage and did not attend actively the Roman Jewish community. On October 28, 1938, soon after the racial laws came into effect, Bruno was granted the Catholic baptism. But it all came too late to escape the regime's grip tightening around the Jews. The parish priest tried to help, writing that Bruno Ascoli had been attending catechism since August of that year, but his intervention was in vain. I quote again Silvio Ascoli, my family members tried to apply to the Italian Ministry of the Interior, attesting that they were not members of the Jewish community, but the response was that anyone who had a Jewish parent and could not prove that they belonged to another religion from before the racial laws came into effect was considered Jewish. My father had been baptized too late. For my parents, it was a terrible blow. Thus, the Ascoli family was forced to declare that they belonged to the Jewish race. 2 years later, in 1940, Bruno married in church the Catholic Maria Bianca, although his marriage could not have civil effect. And their son, Silvio, started later. My mother married him knowing what she was getting into. Around the 16th of October 1943, Bruno Ascoli became a wanted man. One day, fascists and Nazis showed up at their house, asking for my father. He fortunately was outside. His parents managed to warn him not to return. Bruno escaped and found temporary lodging in a loft in the garage of a tire dealer. His son reports, he stayed there for 2 weeks. My mother would go and sneak him food. But at the end of October, the tire dealer had him dislodged because it had become too dangerous to keep him there. That's when, thanks to the interest of an uncle who worked at the Vatican Museum as an usher, my father was enrolled into the Palatine Guards. 7th photo. Bruno Ascoli became an auxiliary of the Pope's honorary guard and found shelter residing in the Vatican. Next photo. He stayed there for a few months. There are photos of him dressed as a Palatine guard inside the Vatican walls. And in December 1943, he received the precious safe conduct from the Holy See, attesting to his memberships in the Pope's Corps of Honor. His son Silvio explained that there was a sort of a rotation of the company in an effort to save as many persecuted people as possible. In early 1944, the Holy See appointed Bruno to another hiding place in Via Mocenigo near the Vatican walls at a lumber yard. And this attests that there was an organized network of assistance and help. These were only 2 episodes of which my grandfather was not only testimony, but also partly the architect. Thank you so much for your attention.
What I'd like to do now is go over certain facts of the events of October 16th, which was very significant. There's certain information that Mary and I went to Germany, for example, and we got the translation, the testimony of General Karl Wolff, who was the commander in Italy. He was Heinrich Himmler's deputy. And in this testimony, which was done in 1972, the General Wolff tells how Adolf Hitler ordered him to develop a plan to invade the Vatican, in which what was going to happen is that the Germans were going to be dressed as Italian partisans, and they were going to break into the Vatican and start killing every priest or bishop or cardinal they could find. Then the German troops who were stationed around the Vatican would then rush in and save Pope Pius XII, but he would be taken to Liechtenstein and he would be assassinated. Now, 1 month before the arrest of the Roman Jews, the Pope was made aware of this, and he actually called the cardinals together and said, look, they're going to come, when anybody enters Vatican state territory, you're immediately to leave for Portugal and elect a new Pope. Because in my desk is my letter of resignation, because when the Germans come, they're going to drag out Eugenio Pacelli, not Pius XII. And so this is a very, very important factor. Why is this important? Because anybody who has any familiarity with the military and understand what would happen, the German officers knew very well that if the Vatican were invaded and the Pope kidnapped, there would be riots all over Catholic Europe. And they would not be able to fight the war or provide services or take care of the troops fighting. And so it would have been a disaster. So they did everything possible to dissuade Hitler from ordering the invasion. And this is very, very important because the Pope was very well aware of this. And he used that particular point to end the arrest of the Roman Jews. There were almost 11,000 Jews in Rome at the time. 8,000, we have a telegram from Berlin where they were ordering the 8,000 Jews of Rome to be sent to Mauthausen as hostages, not to Auschwitz. And so we knew that, plus there were about at least 3,000 from other countries that were there. And so when the arrest started, and Bill is going to discuss exactly what happened on that day and how it was Pius XII who acted directly to end the arrest at 2 o'clock the day it started. And then, as they talk about the Pope's silence, he was not silent. He was screaming at the top of his lungs, directing life-saving efforts all over the world. And we have documented so many of these efforts in many of the countries throughout Europe, in South America, and in the United States, and all over the world, in the Dominican Republic, that Vatican officials were doing it to save Jewish lives. But I think it's very important to note, and most of the historical revisionists do not accept the fact that there was going to be an invasion. The fact is that there's proof of this in the Acts and Documents of the Holy See, because we have one letter where the Cardinal Secretary of State is ordering the commander of the Swiss Guard, do not resist invading German forces, because they got 184 Swiss Guard with picks facing the German army coming in. So do not do that. It would be sensitive. You'd be killed. And also, they also had provisions where they were talking about how they were going to save the treasures of the Vatican Library and the Vatican Museum, how they were going to hide these if there was an invasion, which, by the way, the British did as well. They took apart the crown jewels and they hid them, expecting if they were going to be invaded. But the point is, because it never happened, does not mean it wasn't planned, and does not mean that people did not know about this. Pope Pius XII was very well aware of it, and he used this as a very important tool. And I think that Bill can describe the events that occurred that day 80 years ago today.
Thank you very much for having me, Gary. It's a privilege to be here with you and Dr. X and Princess Pacelli. This is a solemn day. We memorialize and remember all the victims of October 16, 1943 in Rome. At the same time, we see in our own time the terrible echoes of the profound evil and profound sin of anti-Semitism that was recently unleashed in Israel upon the poor people of Israel. And I just wanted to say my prayer, I join with all people of goodwill praying for the peace restored for the people of Israel, the Jewish community there, certainly the innocent civilians in Palestine, the Catholics there. The whole situation is tragic, but we know that there will be better times, and we trust. As Gary pointed out, October 16th is one of the focal points of the whole debate on Pope Pius XII. And one of the things that the critics do is they zero in on this and they portray Pius XII, because they think that they have Pius XII nailed against the wall here. They think they have him guilty. But the problem with their allegations is that none of it is based on fact. It's based upon conjectures and lies and smears. And now we have the documentation to prove it. As Gary pointed out, right from the very second that the Pope learned, early in the morning, of the roundup, the Nazi assault on Rome's Jewish community, he was saying Mass privately in his chapel, and he was awakened, and he was. No one ever. The significance is that you have to understand, no one ever interfered with the Pope when he was saying Mass privately. It was unheard of, and yet Princess Cortez Pignatelli, who had been alerted to what was happening to Jews, had her chauffeur drive to the Vatican, past the guards, and she stormed into the Pope's private residence, and she said, my gosh, Pope, my Holy Father, you must do something. The poor Jews are being persecuted savagely. And he immediately got up from what he was doing, stopped his Mass, which he never did, I don't think, in his entire life, and he said, let's go make some phone calls. So what he did is he summoned, he called Cardinal Maglione, his own Secretary of State, and he had the German ambassador summoned to the Vatican. And they had a very interesting discovery, which in itself proves many of the falsehoods that are propounded to this day. In this conversation, which we have documented, the Jesuits, archivists have documented the acts, it's been discussed many times. What does Cardinal Maglione say in defense of the Jews? 3 times he tells the German ambassador, von Weizsäcker, 3 times he says, this cannot happen under the eyes of the very Holy Father. People being persecuted on behalf of their religion and race, and he mentions the Jews 3 times. And by the way, he only mentions Jews. He doesn't say baptized Jews or Christianized Jews. He mentions Jews, which is crucial because later on they say, well, he was only concerned about baptized Jews. That was falsehood that Dr. X will speak about. But the significant point is that the very first intervention he made, very explicitly, speaking on behalf of the Pope's representative spoke on behalf of the Jews 3 times. Now, because the Pope did not trust German von Weizsäcker, the German ambassador to Rome, he was very unreliable. Plus, although he was under threat from the Nazis if he didn't do what they were told, he did something more significant, which did have an effect. Unfortunately, von Weizsäcker didn't do much to help. But Pope Pius XII intervened by contacting his nephew, Carlo Pacelli, and he had Carlo Pacelli contact Bishop Hudal, who himself had a very controversial reputation, although as it turns out, he actually intervened to help many Jews. And he had Bishop Hudal write a very strong letter to the German commander of the city of Rome at that time, General Stahel. And General Stahel, who was actually a very sympathetic and humane man and was horrified by what was going on, himself picked up the phone and he called Heinrich Himmler, who was a notorious Nazi henchman, and he said that these arrests must stop, because if they do not, it will take away from our war effort and it will destroy our whole point of defeating the Allies. And so Himmler, surprised and shocked and angered about what he was saying, nonetheless conformed, and the Nazi raid on Rome's Jews, which was supposed to end, which was supposed to be completed and exterminate all of the Jews of Rome. They had about, it used to be thought it was about 8,000. Actually, subsequent research has shown it was about 10 to 12,000. The raid on Rome Jews suddenly stopped. It actually stopped before the Nazi raid was complete. Now, some of the critics say, oh, the Nazis apparently, out of the goodness of their own heart, just stopped on their own, or they couldn't find Jews. Let me tell you something. Everybody who has studied the Nazi regime knows they went from house to house and house, and their goal was to exterminate every last Jewish person on the face of the earth. The idea that they stopped on their own is ludicrous. They stopped because of the intervention of Pope Pius XII through General Stahel. And we know that that was not just something made up by Pius XII's defenders, because there were two eyewitnesses. One of them was named Nicholas Kunkel, a German officer, and another one, who, a testimony that's very rarely known, Gary can speak about, General Bielitz. And they both saw and they witnessed General Stahel intervene and pick up the phone and told Hitler that the arrest must stop because this would prove catastrophic to their own military effort. And incidentally, General Stahel paid a heavy price for that. He was sent to the Russian front, where he died it was soon afterwards, and he died in a prisoner of war camp. But the point of this intervention is to show, far from being passive and inactive and sitting on his throne and being silent in stony silence, as one critic falsely said, the Pope was alive with action. His heart was bleeding for everyone who was suffering, particularly on behalf, as Cardinal Leon said, of the Jews. So that was one of the high points. They say this was the worst thing that Pius XII ever did. In fact, that was one of his finest hours. And we know it was one of his finest hours because the Jews of Rome at that time, as well as the Catholic rescuers themselves, gave him tremendous credit. So don't believe what you hear about October 16th until you study the facts, until you study the eyewitnesses and so forth. Now, I'd like to...
Yeah, there are a couple of points that we can make. That the fact that, again, if you remember the threat to invade the Vatican, that was the tool that Pius XII used. Now, how did that work? When Alois Hudal wrote the letter to General Stahel, he told him that the Pope was going to speak out. If you do not end these arrests, the Pope would speak out. We also have a copy of the letter, and we have a copy of the telephone conversation. The Pope would speak out. Stahel knew that if that happened, Hitler would have ordered the invasion to start, the invasion of the Vatican, which would have been catastrophic. But we know from General Dietrich Baylitz, who was who had to listen in. Hitler would have a German officer listening in on any conversations between his commands and so on. And Baylitz was interviewed by a friend of ours, Father Gumpel, and the testimony was that he got on the telephone and he said to Heinrich Himmler, he said, I need 384 troops to arrest the Jews of Rome, which is normally not a problem. However, the Allies have full air superiority. The partisans are picking us off at night, and you're expecting our troops in Rome to supply the troops fighting down south, which is a problem. I am not going to be able to do this. So you have to assume responsibility that we can't supply the troops fighting down south. And so Heinrich Himmler, not being a military man, said, well, we're going to end the arrest for special circumstances in Rome. And he placed the order at 12 noon, 2 p.m. that day, it ended. And then Pius XII, as I said, was screaming at the top of his lungs, handling the hiding of the Jews. And that's why Princess Pacelli is talking about the Palatine Guard. They put 1,000 here. They had them in the Vatican itself. We've interviewed many people who were physically saved by the Vatican. Okay. And so and a very, very important point. So these are things that were going on and all over the world at the time. He was hiding them all over Rome. Catholic homes were taking them in and so on. And all the ecclesiastical houses, they had special signs on it that German troops are not permitted to enter these premises. That was signed by General Stahl, which meant that they were able to hide a number of Jews. But here's the critical part. If he had spoken out, like everybody's saying, they say, oh, he was silent, he should have spoken. Here's what would have happened. What would happen is that the neutrality of the Vatican, the Holy See, would have been breached. Once that happened, all of the Catholic facilities and ecclesiastical houses around Europe that were hiding Jews would be open to being raided, and they would not just arrest the Jews being protected, they would have arrested all the Catholic caretakers. So it was absolutely a disastrous set of circumstances, and this is something they had to consider. And so it's all nice today for everybody, well, he should have spoken out, you know. No, he shouldn't have spoken out. What they did was he acted to save as many people as he could. Yeah.
I just wanted to mention that, first of all, before the raid takes place in October 1943, the war had begun in 1939. From 1939 to 1943, Pope Pius XII had made many, many statements on behalf of those being persecuted and killed on behalf of their race. Many, many statements in defense of, obviously, Jews and others who were under the siege of the Nazis. And so to think that by that point he was, quote, silent, when in fact he was prudent and he was strategic, but he was not silent, he had already instilled in their heart, in the rescuer's heart, as they have said, the will to rescue, the desire to rescue, the passion to rescue. And I just, to give you an example of this, because there are many diaries that exist from that time, Monsignor John Patrick Carroll Abbon, who was a great priest rescuer, he was from Ireland, he worked in the Vatican, he wrote his memoirs in 1964, and he said at the very time of the raid, he said, on entering, he talked about what was going on. I just want to mention a couple of paragraphs because they're very relevant. On entering the convent of Our Lady of Sign that morning to say Mass, we found the place in an uproar. A crowd of Jewish men, of women, and their children had sought refuge there from the Rhine, and they were in a state bordering on hysteria. Some of them had their menfolk taken away. Others did not know where their husbands and sons had gone to seek a hiding place. Almost immediately, word came from the Vatican that because of the emergency, nuns would be allowed to give hospitality in their convents to Jewish men as well as their families. Soon after, a document arrived from Cardinal Maglione, Secretary of State of Pius XII, that was the one signed by General Stahl, to be affixed to the front door stating that the convent and all others was under the special protection of the Holy See. The Vatican had been able to have it countersigned by General Stahl. And just to conclude, going back to the hospital that day, I noticed that a similar document had been affixed to the door of the Franciscan monastery where he worked. And then finally he says, with each day that passed, my assistant, Monsignor Bertucci, and I found ourselves becoming increasingly involved in the problems of the highways. The word had passed from one good sister to another, from one convent to another. Soon we were in touch with many of the more than 150 religious institutions that were sheltering the Jews. So all of this was the result of the coordinated action of Pope Pius XII and the heroic religious sisters and nuns and ordinary Catholic laymen that were doing it. This is an eyewitness report. I can cite many more, but this just illustrates what the Pope, Gary, and what Princess Pacelli have been saying.
I do want to introduce Dr. Johann Ix, who's the archivist for the Vatican Secretary of State, and he previously had been the archivist of many, many other very important archives. He's very, very well aware. But he just recently wrote the book, the Pope's Cabinet, where they actually found all of in the Secretary of State, the documents where each member of the Curia were doing things and how they were acting and so on. It was remarkable. And Johann.
Yes, just for the public to show what we are talking about. Only in the archives of the Secretary of State, historical archives, of which I'm director, we have about 3 million documents on only the pontificate of Pius XII. 1,600,000 are now digitalized and accessible by digitalization, which of course makes much easier the access for researchers. On the other side of the apostolic archives, which contain where the other archives of the Secretary of State, the other section of the Secretary of State, General Affairs, is kept, they have 3 times that quantity of documents. So they come over 10 million documents, I think. You can imagine these are only two of the major archives of the Vatican. There is no individual, however, who will be able to read all that in a lifetime, I think. Because we have to add Propaganda Fide, all the mission archives, then the Doctrine of Faith, so Santo Officio, Inquisition, and other more little archives, but important. Also, the Oriental churches have their own archives, and that will be not as much as we have, but anyway, 1.5 million or 2 will be there. So if you take it all together, it is really an enormous challenge to read everything. Now, I read before writing the book 800,000 documents all over, and so I have an impression, and the impression that came to me was immediately something else than that we are used to here. You heard, of course, of the book of a book entitled Hitler's Pope. So the Pope of Hitler. Now, I was very happily surprised to find Eugenio Pacelli, as a Pope in friendly correspondence with President Roosevelt. And an amount of letters which are really individual, personal between those two, and in which they really declare themselves so friends, and in which they say together we have to stand the evil in the world together, and they recognize both of them having a mission in the world. All of a sudden, the Hitler's Pope went up to being the American president's Pope almost. So there was something going wrong with the vision on the Pacelli Pope. Now, another thing that people didn't know and that all of a sudden came up, I tell you this because archives sometimes have this effect. If you find all of a sudden that in March 1943, the diplomacy with Germany was blown up and there was a Cold War. So if we talk about the facts of October, Germany is in that moment in a Cold War with the Vatican. A Cold War, it means there is no normal bilateral diplomacy in course anymore. It was blown up by the Germans. Both parties decided not to tell it to anyone, not to the Americans, not to the British, not to the French, so not to the Polish. So no one knew, in fact, that, and they had both reasons to keep it secret, but there was no diplomacy anymore, as later on the Vatican had no diplomacy in the Cold War with Russia. It's the same situation. Now, nobody knew that. So from March 1943 onwards, till the end of the war, the situation and also the dialogue with the ambassador to the Holy See has to be seen in that light. Okay? And all facts become a little bit different. Now, this only to say that there are a lot of different surprises. And there are two of them, if I have the time, to present to you, and so you can take it home. One practical one is you can at home open the website of the Secretary of State on the Vatican side. You go to Secretary of State, Archivio Storico, Historical Archive, and there you can find an entrance to the Hebraic files, the files of the Jews. Now, these files of the Jews was the great surprise, I must say. No one knew about that. Even the 4 Jesuits who made the volumes years ago never mentioned really the existence of these files. What are these files? These files contain requests of Jews all over Europe to the Pope, personally, for help. Now, this is enormously strange. I think that no one of us would have the courage to write a letter to the Pope immediately today in Rome, asking the Pope to do something on this situation. Now, these are Jews, and it are not only baptized Jews, also that, because it was said and in the press, of course, that it was only baptized Jews, and other authors also, or colleagues, try to, minimize the, let's say, the will of the Pope to help all of them. There are a lot of Jews of the faith of Abraham also present in Moses. So I tell that because these Hebraic files bring us to something else, because on the other side, in the Apostolic Archives, Hubert Wolff founded 15,000 letters to the Pope. Now, 15,000 plus 2,800 makes 17,800 letters of Jews to the Pope. Now, explain to me, what does that mean? A Jew writes to someone who would be an anti-Semite. A Jew would write to someone of who he knows he is not, is ignoring their faith. I don't think so. Jews that write in letters in the camp here, they said to me that you are the last help, the last possible help, in my situation. Now, the Jew in the camp said to me, so it was known by Jews. It was said among them, among themselves. The Pope is the only one who could do possibly still something for you. Now, this is important. Another thing that comes out naturally was the help of the Vatican, because there is an office. There is an office, and we didn't know that. There is an office dealing with 24 hours, 24, with Jews, and not one office. Because I told you, there are 15,000 at the other side. So the other section, the General Affairs from Secretary of State, which are internal affairs in fact, have also an office. So there were two offices working day and night for Jews. Now, which ministry in the world did the same? I challenge every one of you to tell me which country, which nation decided to put aside the offices they have in foreign affairs or internal affairs, an office dedicated only to Jews and to help to Jews. No one, not even Sweden, which were very involved in the help to Jews in Europe. Now, this is another fact that we say. Now, this Pope was not Jewish friendly, was, as the literature said until now. And all of a sudden, we find all kinds of, elements that point in a complete other direction. I came, of course, reading 800,000 documents on the Second World War immediately to something else. There is a network, and I do it very briefly, because there is a network on different levels. The level of Rome, the level of Italy, the level of Europe, and the level of the world. Now, it is too short here to show you and to tell you everything of it. But I can tell you that these levels were firstly organized by people that were appointed for the job. Appointment, that means it were not people that, were willing just by themselves to do something for Jews. No, it was someone who was indicating, you will do this and you will do that. And these were, of course, the nuncios, the bishops, but there were also lay people, religious people, on the various levels active. And that made it possible to really discover a silent resistance work, of which Pius XII is the head. And that's the most comical one, because all of a sudden he invented himself a resistance network which worked perfectly. Of course, it didn't reach every time its aim, because the Germans, the Nazis, and also fascist regimes were, of course, obstacles, continuously obstacles, and intercepted also people that were taken out and were driven to liberty on the other side of the ocean. somewhere, or to the Holy Land. But anyway, they tried, and they were trying every day, every night. Okay? And this is also a reality which was not visible before. And then, of course, one of the most, and I close here, is what Cardinal Parolin last week, by the opening of the conference, in fact, indicated, and it was forgotten by all of the speakers afterwards and relators. And it has to do with the doctrine of Pacelli, Eugenio Pacelli, on which we, of course, have only one side's information that he was probably an anti-Semite, anti-Judaic. Now, we found documents of the First World War in which it is clearly stated that the Jews are our brethren, like all men of the world are our brethren. Now, we are in 1916. And it is the American Jewish Committee, exactly from New York, asking it. And this is also surprising that all the, let's say, specialists in the field of Judaic-Christian relations never came to this document that was published in the American Jewish Journal here in New York on the front page with a photo of Benedict XV in that time and with the text full in English of the Vatican. It were the Jews of New York to ask the Holy See, can we publish this? Because we consider this as an encyclical for the Jews in the world. Now, it was not the Vatican. The Vatican said, of course, publish this. It is an official document. We have nothing against that. And the Jews published that. 3 years later, the Ashkenazi from Jerusalem asked again a document in favor of the Jews that, there were problems also in Poland and in other parts of Central Europe with Jews. And they asked a sustain of the Holy See for their fellow Jews. And the Holy See says, okay, we did that already 3 years ago, we do it again. And we send you the text that we produced 3 years ago. Now, 2 times, that means it is a doctrine. It means we stay at this as magisterium for the Catholic faithful. Of course, that doesn't mean that all Catholic faithful all of a sudden are not anti-Semite or anti-Judaic. It means only that on the top, someone says that this should be the way a Catholic should think about that and feel. And Roma docet, learns the people. Now, it will take decades and decades, and also today still, to learn the people what is the real doctrine of the Catholic Church on the Jews. And I tell you that 1916 is more than 100 years before Fratelli Tutti. Yeah? All brothers. And this is amazing because this is a fresh encyclical, we know, but this fresh encyclical, without knowing it probably, had in itself a sort of seed which came from 1916. And this 1916 seed was sowed by no one else than Eugenio Pacelli, who was in that time the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Benedict XV in the First World War. And this document could not go out without, let's say, his approval. And I would go further because I have, let's say, intuition, and I will work on that in the future, that it was he to ask someone else to work on the doctrine on the Jews for Catholics in that time. And he was asking a specialist in the field. And the specialist gave him probably the result of his studies. And by these studies, they had the courage to make this document as such. And so it was a new start. And these Jews of New York were right. They said, this is a milestone in the history of Jewish-Christian relations, and it is as an encyclical for us. I thank you.
I want to point out a couple of very important points which should be noted. You'll hear a lot of the critics say, well, they only help baptize Jews, not real Jews. Here was a very important point. When Germany signed a concordat with the Holy See, there's a specific point that the Vatican said that we believe Judaism is a religion. It is not a race. And therefore, anybody who converts to Christianity would be considered a Christian. Now, why is this important? Because when they were giving out tens of thousands of false baptismal papers, they were legally allowed to do that. Because these people, well, they're converted according to our concordat. It's number one. That's a very, very important point. We also, if you were to go on a computer and do a search, 1939 to 1958, Jews and Pope Pius XII, you will not find one negative article. Well, how is this possible? Here, this guy is Hitler's Pope. He was terrible. He's a Nazi Pope and all this. How is that possible? But it is possible. This is the reality. And what Johann was saying, when Pave the Way went down, we had obtained papal permission to publish the documents. We now have 76,000 pages, free for anybody to look at on our website, download, whatever you needed. But we went to Campania, and we discovered 3,000 pages of documents of exactly the letters writing, asking for help. And the Vatican actually had one of the agents had nuns sitting there typing a little card, trying to reunite families and trying to get visas for people, and we'd get the responses. And so we got them in Vienna, we got them in Assisi, documents like this. This is what's so outrageous about this. And by the way, in order to protect Jews, they were allowed to, women can go into monasteries and men into convents. Only the Pope can lift the ban of cloister to allow them to do this in order to save as many people as possible. My wife Meredith and I went to a number of convents in Rome and saw exactly where these people were hidden. And the allegation, well, the Pope was sitting there and nobody knew what he was sort of frightened, he didn't do anything, and it was up to the individual priest to do this. This is absolute nonsense. Somebody just sent me a book this past week where exactly the same thing was done in Croatia, in Zagreb, in a hospital. We saw the nuns hiding the Jews in Zagreb. It happened all over the world. We interviewed Monsignor Giovanni Ferrafino, who actually took Jews from Portugal to the Dominican Republic from 1939 to 1945, and he would receive a double encrypted telegram twice a year from Pius XII, which he had to hand deliver to General Trujillo, because he wouldn't get the visas for the Jews coming into Dominican Republic. He said, it has to be in the name of the Pope. And he would take a 2-day ride from Port-au-Prince, Haiti, and so you'll hear his entire story. And he was physically with the Pope before he left for Haiti, and the Pope would greet all of the nuncios before they would leave. And the Pope is saying, he says, why don't the Spanish understand? Why don't the Americans see? We have to save this vibrant community. He banged his hand on the table. This is what Ferrafino was saying in his interview. We have the same thing with Monsignor Sentione, who is in Rome in the St. Raphael Society. They went to the papal palace to get passports and cash for Jews escaping to Switzerland. So we have so many different examples of this that the revisionists just want to ignore. It never happened. And so they come up with their own theories and so on. So it's very, very important, something to consider. And by the way, we actually did, we went to Campania, we went to Assisi, we went to Vienna, 250 pages of documents. So we have letters, they come back, and the Holy Father, the August Pontiff, is sending X number, tens of thousands of lira for the support of the Israelites in your community. How many letters like that we have? And he did nothing? This is outrageous. Bill, go ahead.
I just wanted to add, I had mentioned recently the testimony of Monsignor J. Patrick Carroll, a great Irish rescuer. There's another great Irishman, perhaps better known, Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty, who is mentioned in Dr. Ix's book. Some of you may have seen the great film. It has a few.
Scarlet.
The Scarlet and the Black, starring Gregory Gregory Peck, the great actor Gregory Peck. And that shows the Pope aware and approving, but even the great Sir John Gilda, who I love, portrays the Pope, he portrays him as sort of aloof, as sort of concerned. Actually, he was very actively involved. I have spoken to members of the O'Flaherty family, and they're appreciative of the film. They said that it underplays and downplays the Pope's active involvement. I just want to mention a few things to underscore what my distinguished colleagues have said. Dr. Ix spoke about the warm relationship between FDR and Eugenio Pacelli, Pope Pius XII. And this was established long before he became Pope. There was a recent book published on FDR's main envoy to the Vatican during the war, Myron Taylor, a very fine author named C. Evans Stewart. I just want to say one thing, which is really new and explosive information. There has always been a debate in 1940, shortly after the Pope became, shortly after Pacelli became Pius XII. The Pope met once with the German foreign minister Ribbentrop, and there has always been a debate. What did he say in the meeting? There are rumors that there was a recording, but the recording has never been found. But there's been 3 or 4 or 5 different versions. No one said. What the critics say is that, well, he may have said something of criticism, but there is no evidence that he ever rose a voice in defense of the Jews. Well, here we have new breaking information. According to the new book, Myron Taylor, the man nobody knew, he's FDR, Franklin Roosevelt's main man in Rome. According to the newly released Myron Taylor papers at Cornell University, he says, this is Taylor's testimony, that on the very night that the Pope met Ribbentrop, the German foreign minister, that would have been March 11th, 1940, he was contacted by Monsignor Montini, who would later become St. Paul VI. And to cut to the chase, the message that Monsignor Montini, he wanted to give Taylor a description of what had happened. And this is the key line, according to Taylor. Montini conveyed to Taylor that the Pope asked to know if Hitler's government was not treating the people of Poland, they had just invaded Poland, very cruelly, treating the Jews especially cruelly. Now that's smoking gun material. That is smoking gun. He's saying, this is a primary report from an independent witness, FDR's man in Rome, saying that on the very day the Pope met Ribbentrop, Montini, his close assistant, later to become St. Paul VI, he was saying that yes, the Pope rose and very forcefully rose the crimes that Nazis were committing in Poland, and he especially came to the defense of the Jews. The New York Times actually had a report on this, but they've always denied. Now we have the proof that the New York Times got that right. But this just goes to show you, both internally and externally, he was doing everything in his power to save the Jews and promote the Jews. And just one or two other things. If we have the Palestine Post from December 29th, 1942, I'm not sure if I think that's part of the pictures. 5 days after the Pope gave a very famous address in 1942, a Christmas address, condemning the killing of people based upon their race or heritage, which clearly everyone understood that was listening, was the Jews. The Palestine Post, today's Jerusalem Post, published on December 29, 1942, a short article in which it said the following. It pointed out that the notoriously Nazi paper was attacking the L'Osservatore Romano, which had republished the speech, and it said, and the Nazis were condemning the paper as pro-communist and saying it was the red paper in Latin characters. And then it said, the leading Nazi paper, it was called Volkscher Beobachter. I'm not sure if that's the exact pronouncement, but that was the leading hate sheet of the Nazis. And it condemned the L'Osservatore Romano, the Vatican's newspapers, quote, because it published an article, this would be the 1942 Christmas address, condemning the murder and extermination of Jews in Europe. So, we have proof right at the time, in 1942, this is even before the German occupation of Rome, where the Pope was clearly speaking out on behalf of those being persecuted on behalf of their race, and he was being condemned by the Nazis for his defense and his condemnation, his defense of Jews, and for his condemnation of, quote, the murder and extermination of Jews in Europe. So the Nazis themselves are proof that the Pope did speak out in the words that he thought were just, and it's positive proof that he was not silent during the Holocaust.
Yeah, but there are loads of different examples of that, especially when somebody accuses him of being an anti-Semite. Sometimes they use the expression, he's a classic anti-Semite, which is absurd. It's absolutely ridiculous. Going to high school, the Visconti school, his best friend was an Orthodox Jewish boy by the name of Guido Mendez, and he used to go to his house for Shabbat dinner, learned how to speak Hebrew, borrowed the books of the great rabbis as a young boy, and these are facts. And it was Pius XII. The problem is also that some of the revisionists never bothered to go back in time. Pope Benedict opened the archives in 2006 up to 1939, and had some of these people gone back to 1917, they would have found some of the documentation, which we discovered. Actually, my director for Germany, Michael Hesseman, who's been to the archives over 250 times, and some specific documents. In 1917, the head of the World Zionist Organization, Nachum Sokolov, met with Pacelli when he was the nuncio in Germany. And why? Because he wanted to talk to him about creating a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Pacelli was very excited about this and immediately arranged for Sokolov to meet with the Cardinal Secretary of State. Then again in 1925, the Pope was ill, he was in a hospital, but he granted him an audience and he was with him in 1925. Again, the same subject, starting a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Then he arranged for Nachum Sokolov to meet the Pope. Then again in 1948, at the partitioning of the Holy Land, he encouraged all the Catholic countries to vote in favor of the partitioning. So he's actually responsible for creating the modern state of Israel. And not just that, we have examples like in 1939, we have one letter, I don't know what's coming up, but we have one letter where he was opposing the anti-kosher slaughtering laws of Poland. And so this is a letter to the nuncio encouraging him, and he said, this is a natural right, this is a terrible thing that they're doing, and they were able to defeat that law. And that's very clear. Anti-Semites don't do that. He intervened with the German, this was an interesting story, a Russian pianist in the Munich orchestra, his name was Osip Gavrilovich, was arrested for anti-Semitic reasons. So the conductor asked Pacelli, who was his friend, can you help get him out of prison? And he did. Osip Gavrilovich was became the son-in-law of Mark Twain, married his daughter. So but all of these actions that you take, anti-Semites do not do this. They don't care, and that's the end of it.
One other thing, I have a photo image. It's called Sanctuary in the Vatican from, again, the Palestine Post on June the 22nd, 1944. This is right after the liberation of Rome from the Germans. And one of the things, one of the many pieces of evidence we have which shows positive proof that Pius XII was directly, personally involved in the rescue of Jews that were endangered is the fact that many Jews took sanctuary in his papal summer residence, Castel Gandolfo, which Gary hosted a wonderful conference in 2008, which I attended, met Pope Benedict. It was very beautiful. It had a lot of symbolic meaning because that's where Pius XII saved many Jews. But I just want to give you one little brief quote from what the Palestine Post said right after the liberation. It says, reporting from Vatican City, the reporter says the following, quote, several thousand refugees, largely Jews, so we must have been talking about 750, perhaps over 1,000 Jews, which, by the way, is the number that Oskar Schindler in the great film by Steven Spielberg saved. That was just at Castel Gandolfo. Several thousand refugees, largely Jews, during the weekend, left the papal palace at Castel Gandolfo. They could leave now because it was Rome was liberated. The Pope's summer residence, after enjoying safety there during the recent terror. Besides Jews, persons of all political creeds who had been endangered were given sanctuary at the palace. Before leaving, the refugees conveyed their immense gratitude to the Pope through his representatives. So you see, we have the Jewish community themselves in gratitude and thanks coming out right after the liberation of Rome, going to Vatican City and thanking the Pope for saving their lives, for protecting them. Now, by the way, no one but Pius XII had the authority to open Castel Gandolfo. He was the one that had the keys. So you can't say, well, these were just nice, great priests and nuns that were doing this on their own. No. This was Pius XII's personal intervention. The reason those Jews survived is because Pius XII personally acted to save them.
There's another point that, and I think of this often, the Roman Jewish community today despises him, absolutely despises him. The fact is that he saved their lives. Everybody alive in Rome today of the Jewish community is alive because of his direct actions. And this is proven by the fact that in, I think, 1949, the Italian Jewish community erected a marble placard. And I don't know if you can bring up that picture. This placard, and when it's praising Pius XII for intervening and saving all the lives. And Surprisingly, that placard has disappeared. It was in the Museum of Resistance, but it's gone now. And now you have this entire new population of people who never lived through the war, never had any idea what was going on, who hate him. And you know what? This is a major sin in Judaism. It's a sin of ingratitude. And that's a problem, because these people are alive today because of his direct actions.
I would just want to add that the good news is that we are all sometimes taken in and we believe things that turn out to be not true. And one of the lessons I learned in my life is that one of the great joys of life is to realize you have actually been mistaken. You think that something is terrible, and you actually are told that you're wrong about it. That to me is a great blessing. And it's a relief to me, because if you think something evil is going on and you believe it's not going on, something the exact opposite, that's a great relief and blessing. So I don't blame people that have been misinformed. This is what perhaps they truly believe. But we do have an obligation, certainly within the Jewish and Catholic community, and this also goes for the Catholic Church. When we have sinned, our Jewish brethren have told us so, and they are correct to do that. But when we in the Catholic community know that things have been done and people on outside of the community are not well informed, we have an obligation to very charitably lay out the facts, and the facts are there, they're clear. And the great news is that people are very open-minded in the Jewish community, in the Protestant community. When you present them with these facts, they say, wow, I never knew that. And the joy of learning that something you once thought was terrible was actually a blessing. It's a great blessing to me. So despite the fact that there are lots of myths that continue to circulate, the reason I continue on, the reason Gary continues on, and we all continue on, is to see the joy of their faces when they look at all these documents and they say, wow, this is proof. I am so grateful to learn about this, because otherwise I would have been in the dark.
I'm going to quickly read the placard that was destroyed. It says, "The Pope's efforts did not go unrecognized by the Jewish authorities. Even during the war, the chief rabbi of Jerusalem, Isaac Herzog, sent the Pope a personal message." This is, by the way, the grandfather of the current president of Israel, Herzog. "The people of Israel will never forget what His Holiness and his illustrious delegates, inspired by the eternal principles of religion, which form the very foundations of the true civilization, are doing for us." These are remarks, and one very specific one was a Jewish historian, General Levi, who was a very famous Hungarian Jewish historian, who came out right after the deputy came out and the Russian disinformation program, and it started destroying his reputation. General Levi said, "It's a particularly regrettable irony that the only man in all occupied Europe that did anything to alleviate the suffering is today made the scapegoat for the failures of all of the others." And that has stuck to this very day.
And on that point, Monsignor Carol Abbing, who was right there in Rome during the German occupation and was directly involved with the coordination of Pius XII, and under his inspiration, had this to say about the latter-day critics who have condemned Pius XII based upon unfortunate falsehoods and lies. He said this, quote, "Never in those tragic days could I have foreseen, even in my wildest imaginings, that the man who, more than any other, had tried to alleviate human suffering, had spent himself day by day in his unceasing efforts for peace, would 20 years later be made the scapegoat for men trying to free themselves from their own responsibilities and from the collective guilt that obviously weighs so heavily upon them." There were many, many people to blame, including Christians who shamefully did not live up to the Christian standard, to blame and or who are responsible for the Holocaust. Pius XII is not one of them.
There's one quick quote from Albert Einstein. He's not, a little guy. He's pretty important. And he says that, only the church stood squarely across the path of Hitler's campaign for the suppression of the truth. "I have never had any special interest in the church before, but now I feel great affection and admiration, and I'm forced thus to confess that what I once despised, I now praise unreservedly." So these are incredible statements that these make-believe scholars and all the historical revisionists, they can't seem to get, and that's a problem.
And one of the things, Dr. X mentioned that Cardinal Parolin, number 2 in the Vatican, right under Pope Francis, he's the Cardinal Secretary of State, when he opened the recent major Pius XII conference in Rome about the Vatican archives, he came out just so powerfully and so eloquent, and he mentioned these dramatic finds that Dr. X has made about the 1916 intervention. This is when Eugene Pacelli was a young priest. Young people usually don't like to rock the boat. They're just, they go along with the flow. He spoke out, he took a stand, and he didn't know what would happen to him because there was a lot of anti-Semitism, even sadly sometimes within the church at that time, and he took a bold stand. But in any event, I just wanted to mention one other thing, that one of the most amazing discoveries that I made a few years ago, and now it's become even bigger, is that during the war years in 1941, there was a Jewish ship that was trying to get to Israel, and it shipwrecked. There were 500 Jewish refugees on it, and they were caught by the Italian fascist army and imprisoned on the roads. Yeah. And to make a long story short, one of the men named Howard Hines Whistler was able to thankfully get out through influence off of Rhodes, and he actually made it all the way to Rome, where because of the intervention of a kind priest there, Father Weber, I believe, he was able to actually meet Pope Pius XII in 1941. And during his meeting, which he later wrote about for the Palestine Post, he said, he told the Pope immediately about the 500 Jewish refugees, his fellow Jews who were interned and who were being starved to death because there was a blockade on the Jewish island. And he begged the Pope to intervene, which the Pope did a shortly time thereafter. But the key point of that story is not only did he do this tremendous humanitarian act, saving 500 Jews, he embraced Heinrich Whistler, and he told him, "You have done well, my Jewish friend." This is according to the testimony of Heinrich Whistler. "You have done well, my Jewish friend, to have come to me and told me about what has happened down there in the Italian islands. I have heard about it before," the Pope said, according to Whistler. The pontiff asked him to return with a written report and deliver it to the Vatican Secretary of State, who was dealing with those refugees. In his memoir, Whistler confirms that is exactly what was done. Not only did Pius promise help for refugees, he affirmed Whistler's Jewishness in the presence of a German audience. There were some Germans in the audience. And he said, in clear, loud, unmistakable terms to Whistler, "But now to you, my young friend, you are Jewish. I know what that means in these times we live in. I do hope that you will always be proud to be Jew." That's an amazing statement. And he made a point of saying that
Said it
a second time in front of the Curia, who, lest they had harboring any prejudice of anti-Judaism, he was condemning that. And he said in front of German soldiers who were wandering and being visitors. By the way, when Hitler later found out that some German soldiers who were Catholic, who perhaps were torn in their conscience of the evil they were doing, he ended those audiences right away. But he had a point. He made the point to embrace Heinz Whistler, to embrace his heritage and so forth. And by the way, just recently, I wrote about this story dramatically.
Last week,
if you want to hear about it most dramatic, this is truly Providence. I've been trying to get in touch with the survivors of the Whistler family. And who does Gary meet in coordination with his work on behalf of charitable activities and prosthetics? He meets the granddaughter of Howard Hines Whistler. So he says, "Bill, I'd like to talk to you a little bit. I have a surprise guest." I said, "Who's that?" "It's the granddaughter."
Susan Whistler Cone.
Right, and he puts me on the phone. I'm going to interview her extensively, and she knows everything about her grandfather. She has all the documents to prove. So this story, I'm going to do an updated story based upon what his granddaughter is telling me. But this is Providence. And one last thing. this is a personal thing, but it's amazing. I discovered in the course of my research, he was born on January 7th. Guess whose birthday is also January 7th? Mine. How shocking. These things do not happen. This is Providence, this is God, and this is why I believe in the final analysis, the truth will win over the skeptics, the truth will win out, and one day, Pope Pius XII will be Saint Pope Pius XII.
Yes. We can go on until tomorrow as we keep remembering things, but do anybody have any specific questions that they'd like to ask about events that occurred or had any confusion about anything that happened during this?
Gary, I have some actually that I could read.
Okay, that would be great.
I just have to adjust the mics.
This is Craig, by the way. He's one of the brilliant guys who makes things with Vinny and works with him.
Thank you.
You are brilliant. You are brilliant.
So one of the questions that came in, Jake, am I good right here? You good? Do we have any idea how many Jewish people are reported to have been saved by the efforts of the church?
Yes, we have one, Pincus Lapida was an Israeli diplomat and a Jewish historian who lived through the war. And Pincus Lapida wrote the book, Three Popes and the Jews. And in that book, he states that according to his research, that Pope Pius XII saved as many as 847,000 to 880,000 Jews under the Catholic Church under his pontificate, which again, I'll remind you, is today 25% of the entire world's Jewish population is alive because of his actions.
And to back that up, I had a privilege of interviewing the late, great Sir Martin Gilbert, one of the greatest Jewish and any kind of historian that's ever lived. I spoke to him for 3 weeks, and it was one of my most important interviews I've ever done. And I asked him this dramatic question. I said,
He lived through the war.
He
was a Holocaust
lived through the war.
And we interviewed him also.
Yes, Pave the Way has him on tape recording.
Yep.
And I asked him directly, I said, Sir Martin, did the Pope intervene to rescue Jews, not just in Rome, but all throughout the world? What has your research? No one did more research than him. He's famously, he's the biographer of Churchill. He's written famous books on Auschwitz and the Allies, as well as the Holocaust itself. And he said, well, certainly he did. In every part of the world, Eugenio Pacelli, the Pope, was playing an active half through his nuncios, as Dr. Ix documents so well in his book, in a coordinated effort to rescue world Jewry. And I said, well, how many would you estimate Jews? And he said, some people have said there is hundreds of thousands. Would you say that's an exaggeration or overstatement? He said, no, hundreds of thousands is absolutely, to my mind, absolutely correct. So, it's not just Pincus Lapida, it's Sir Martin Gilbert, who is renowned for his research, and he spent years, decades, going from one archive to the next, and he himself affirmed that, yes, Pope Pius XII and all his diplomats and representatives and the entire Catholic Church under his inspiration did in fact save hundreds of thousands of Jews. St. John Paul II actually pointed this fact out in his famous document on the Holocaust, on the Shoah. And when it was published, it was attacked for making an overstatement. But as we now know from Sir Martin Gilbert and others, that was, if anything, it was a conservative aspect. There is no question, according to Sir Martin, who is one of the greatest historians who ever lived, that the Pope and his allies did indeed save hundreds of thousands of Jewish lives.
Yes, sir.
If you could answer this one in a complete sentence. Did Pius XII ever meet Adolf Hitler?
Absolutely not.
No.
And in fact,
Say it in a complete sentence if you could.
no, Pius XII absolutely did not meet Adolf Hitler. In a couple of the books that were written, there was a picture of actually it was the nuncio to Germany meeting Hitler, with an official diplomatic sense. And in the book, I think it was Cornwell's book, he says, this is Pius XII meeting Adolf Hitler. And it was absolutely not true.
Yeah.
In fact, when Hitler did go to Rome, he left Rome. He closed the Vatican Museum and so on. And he said, the air is foul in Rome. And he went to Castel Gandolfo. He wouldn't even be in the city when Hitler did go.
I can say more. In the 800,000 and more, because there is also pre-war, in our archives, which are the diplomatic archives, so relations with Germany, I found one that was signed by Hitler, one document, and it's the assignment of the ambassador to the Holy See before the war, and that was signed by Hitler. And maybe there will be another official document in that time. I cannot be sure that I saw everything. So, but a personal document or whatever is not there. And that is exactly what I said. At the contrary, with Roosevelt, we have private correspondence which went over the heads of his administration. Tardini, the secretary, so Minister of Foreign Affairs, was outrageous for that. That his Pope was having a relationship with the Protestant president of America, and they didn't know what they were talking about, and that is the reality. And in fact, the absence of documents also in archives says a lot. The absence of letters of Hitler, the absence of letters of other German Nazi primary personalities, says something. They didn't want to have relationship with them. And that's all.
I just wrote one little thing on that because I thought that question might come up. In 1921, shortly after the Nazi Party was founded, but still 12 years before Hitler became German Chancellor, Pacelli, who was then a papal nuncio in Munich, publicly warned Germans not to let the threat of communism blind them to the evils of Nazism. The only other major figure to do that at the time was the famous novelist Thomas Mann. In 1923, Pacelli alerted the Vatican to the rising threat of Nazism. He specifically identified by name Hitler, highlighting his poisonous anti-Semitism and anti-Catholicism. The following year, he wrote his Spears in Rome, describing Nazism as perhaps the greatest heresy of modern times. And finally, in 1929, that was the year he left Germany forever. He never returned, set foot on Nazi Germany soil. He left before Hitler came to power. But in 1929, 4 years before Hitler comes to power in 1933, he is trying to warn the world, according to his mother Pascalina, one of his assistants who wrote her own memoirs. And he was telling anyone who would listen that Hitler was a madman, quote, completely obsessed, capable of destroying everything in his path, including trampling on corpses. So trampling on corpses. What a prophet. One other thing, you may want to mention the Kleifort document that you published.
Actually, I got that from you.
Oh, that's
Bill said that to us. It was a top secret document, right, where was an American ambassador who knew Pacelli in Germany, and Pacelli had now become the Secretary of State. So he writes him a letter, and he's asking for permission. He's going to be in Rome for a short time if he could visit the Sistine Chapel while it was closed. Now, there's a very important part of this because, a side note, when people accuse Pacelli, in 1930, the German bishops excommunicated anyone who joined the Nazi Party, flew the flag, or wore the uniform, and they were not permitted to attend a funeral or anything else. But in this letter that what's his name, Kiefer or something, had written.
A.W. Kiefer. I actually spoke to his son, who was also diplomat.
Yeah. So in this letter, he actually says he gives him permission. Of course, you can come. And this letter was now going to Washington to tell the American government what Pacelli was like. It was 1939, right after he was elected Pope.
Right.
And he said that he could not believe how extreme he hated Hitler. It was his extremeness shocked me in saying that. And he also, in the same letter, that Pacelli said, he says it's even worth losing the young Catholic youth,
yes,
and he's referring to the excommunication, than giving forth to this person. The letter is, it's right. I don't know if you have
and there's so many that what we're trying to demonstrate here in just this. Actually, it's a summary of the mountain of evidence that we now have, is the incredible stature and high moral character of Eugenio Pacelli as a boy, as a young priest, as a cardinal secretary of state, as a pope. All throughout his life, there is this golden thread of loving people, reaching out to people, condemning racism, condemning anti-Semitism, just showing what it truly means to be a Christian witness in our times. And that's why it's so, Pope Francis, by the way, credit to him, he has given great credit to Pope Pius XII. He's never believed any of these lies or falsehoods, and he continually praises him for taking so many risks and coming to the defense of the Jews when they were in their most trying hour.
Great.
So I have two more questions, and then if there's anyone in the audience that wants to ask a question, just raise your hand. Just have two more quick ones. Did the Vatican and Pius XII harbor and help Nazi war criminals?
Yes.
No.
Well, no, they didn't know the Vatican did. But one bishop, Bishop Hudal, actually...
Draganovic, Hudal, and a Franciscan father, and someone else, there were single people. Like during the war, there were single bishops, fascists or pro-Nazi. There were also, after the war, single person, individuals, acting, let's say, not as the Holy See wanted they would act. And in the files, and I saw them, they are very preoccupied about this. The file from Draganovic, for instance,
yes.
and also Hudal, they are very clear on that. Tardini is saying these people they will be for us a big problem afterwards. And of course, he knew that. He foresaw. He had to.
I just want to add, they were renegade. They were renegade people who were not just like they were bad and evil priests and they were bad people in all different professions. It does not reflect the institution per se. But I should point out that right after the war, the Nuremberg war crime trials asked for Pope Pius XII for evidence to prosecute the Nazi war criminals, which he gave them in abundance, and they were very grateful. So far from personally helping Nazi war criminals, that was done by evil priests disobeying the church teachings of Pius XII. Pius XII actually helped prosecute Nazi war criminals, and that's a fact.
There's one example, I give a Jewish example. I said you don't blame the entire church for the actions of a few renegade priests. Just like you don't blame all the Jewish people for the fact that among the cruelest guards in the concentration camps were called kapos.
No,
they were Jewish guards and they were cruel, but you don't blame everybody else for that.
But you have to see that the story on this originated exactly in the years of the Black Legend.
That's right.
And they needed the scapegoat in the Vatican, which was Rudal, bishop working at the disciplinary section of the Holy Office, just to, of course, throw a shadow on Pius XII, that he was in fact protecting those people who were
And
acting for ex-Nazis. And that was the logic, and that was the logic that was, of course, turned out in, let's say, newspaper language by all journalists and thrown over your head. But it is not true, because the Holy See, the Vatican, was firmly against it, that people participated in such a way to, let's say, passage for ex-Nazis. But they could not intervene. I mean, it's difficult to do that.
this is part of the communist life factor. You see, after Nazism was defeated, the great struggle at the time, we don't think about it too much today because communism has been discredited. It was between communism and the Catholic Church. So what do the communists do? They're doing everything in their power to smear and defame Pius XII. And they feed these false stories about him being pro-Nazi, wanting Nazi war criminals and so forth. And this is all part of the the communist smear campaign. So it's ironic that Pope Pius XII, as well as his predecessor, Pius XI, spoke out more clearly and forcefully against the totalitarian evils of Nazism and communism than any force upon earth. They, later on, would become the victims of their smear campaigns. But the good news is the truth is outing, and we now know the truth.
There was a document that I remember hearing about, that Johann might recall, where somebody had requested of Montini, can we not help a few of these Nazi soldiers? And Montini said, are you out of your mind? These people tried to kill the Pope and tried to think we want us to help them? Something like that. And I understand also the Red Cross actually helped more Nazis escape than
yeah, but also the Holy See helps people, and after the war they sheltered even people.
Yeah, that's right.
And gave them asylum in the Vatican. And in fact, they are attacked on that by the French. In my book, there is a good example.
Yeah.
And but also there, the Holy See is very clear on that. People that have really blood on their hands, they should be put before a trial.
Think of the refugee situation. We want to embrace refugees as best we can. All throughout the world, we want to do that. But sometimes evil, terrorist, criminal people, infiltrate into them, and they get through. That's what happened in this sense. And so, what happens? You have millions of people, and they find a handful of Nazi war criminals and say, "Oh, look, the Vatican supports Nazis." That does not, as I just pointed out. The Vatican was trying to put people's lives back together, which were shattered after World War II. The Nazi war criminals that survived, they were exploiting this process of humanitarianism, and some of them got through, but it was not the Vatican's intent. And as I said, when they found out the facts, and when the truth was shown at the Nuremberg trials, when the Pope and his associates, it gave them all the evidence they needed to prosecute the Nazi war criminals.
I have one more, and then I can walk around the room. Had he retired as Pope while he was still living, would Pius XII have been supportive of Vatican II?
How can what?
Had the Pope retired while he was still living, would Pius XII have been supportive of Vatican II?
Oh,
Dr.
this is a Catholic issue.
I'll say one more thing, and then I'll have Dr. X take over. There is no question that one of the great things about Vatican II is that no Pope is quoted more frequently in the documents of Vatican II then Pope Pius XII. The only other source that's quoted more frequently is sacred scripture itself. So in my opinion, there's that, according to John the 23rd, St. John the 23rd, and St. Paul VI, Vatican II was in many respects a project after his death of Pope Pius XII. So there's no question that running throughout Vatican II are the teachings, developed teachings, to the great credit of St. John the 23rd, extended and expanded for the modern world, and St. Paul VI. But certainly with the imprint of Pope Pius XII. Like
yes, I have little to add to that, but the Nostra Aetate, as you read in my book, for me is the crystallization of the Pius XII doctrine. So also there we find something that is already present in the Church, in the magisterium of the Pope, and later on in the Council, Second Vatican Council, it was crystallized in a document. For me, but someone will.
He planted. I think what you said earlier.
Agreement.
He planted the seeds, and they were flowers.
Yes.
The flowering became out years later. But he was the first one who planted those seeds, and that's.
It's also curious that when the Operation C12 started, it was actually during the period of Second Vatican Council, and the Declaration Nostra Aetate has changed religion, the Vatican's position in its relations with all the religions. So it's a strange coincidence that that's when the Russians decided to do this, 5 years after he died.
I'm just going to get a question from the audience.
There's an organization in Israel that is responsible for granting the, I'll call it the Jewish equivalent.
Righteous among nations.
Righteous among nations.
At Yad Vashem.
I think it's called Yad Vashem,
Yeah.
And I understand that Pius XII has never been put on that list.
No, that's not true.
That's not true? Is he
No,
on that
because
list?
I actually submitted 158 pages to the Office of the Righteous. And I had the chief rabbi of Efrat, Israel, submit those pages recommending him for righteous among nations. The problem is that politics jumps into this. This is a real serious problem because nobody's going to do anything that's going to be disruptive politically. And Yad Vashem is they raise money for their work and everything, and then they're going to upset a lot of people until such time as this cloud, this black legend is gone. It's not going to be considered. But I can tell you that some of the documents that we submitted, one in particular I'm going to tell you, was a Jewish woman by the name of Luciana Zevi. And we took her testimony, and it's signed and by our attorney in Rome and so on. Luciana Zevi met Pius XII with her mother, her father, and her uncles in 1948, I believe, 1948. And she goes up, and this is what she testifies. And her father walks in and looks at Pius XII, and it's a Jewish family, looks at Pius XII. He said, "You were dressed as a Capuchin monk." And he looks at Montini, "And you were dressed as a regular priest." And he said, "You came into the ghetto and you brought me into the Vatican. You were the ones that brought me in." And when I had the letter, Vatican said, "Don't publish that. Don't publish that." I said, "I sure will publish that." The fact that the Pope actually, and the funny thing is that the people we know who were close to him, he was very precise. For example, if he were quoting a book, and quoting something, even if he had a perfect recollection, he would insist on getting the original book back. And this is, he wanted proof himself. And this people actually said, we had another Jewish fellow who was saved and actually went to the Dominican Republic, and we have his documents from his son. That's one of the other testimonies we got, where he said that he was brought to the Vatican. He stayed there for several weeks, where he saw Pius XII on several occasions, which shows why the Pope didn't know what was going on. Well, he was in the Vatican on several occasions, and then he was sent. The Vatican arranged for him to go through the south of France into Portugal. He got his visa to go to the Dominican Republic on the Serra Pinta, which we have the interview of the Monsignor Ferrafino, who actually took him there, and they developed a business. And this is a Jewish guy who lives in North Carolina. He's on the Holocaust Committee. He's one of the testimonies. We have a whole load of these. And the fact is, he qualifies, because we know there was an active plan to invade the Vatican and kill him. So even under that situation, he acted to save as many Jewish lives as he could.
So Yad Vashem is sitting on this.
It's sitting on it, yeah. And then at the point politically it'll be okay, they may advance it. I don't know when that'll happen.
Dr. Ix makes the points that a number of papal nuncios who were appointed by Pius XII
Right.
taking the direct instruction, have been declared righteous Gentiles, but their commander-in-chief, it has not yet been appointed, which is a little strange.
Yep.
Well, I think, by the way, in 2012, Yad Vashem, to its credit, they had an unfortunate anti-Pius XII exhibit. They've since moderated. So, and they hopefully, and we trust, they will moderate further and eventually recognize the greatness and sanctity and righteousness of Pope Pius XII. The time will come. I predict that.
No.
Okay. Oh, I want to add one thing. Everyone knows St. John the 23rd. They love him. He's the big roly-poly pope, and he's the the Pillsbury doughboy. He was a very serious man, a very serious pope. He loved Pius XII. I just wanted to add one thing. Before he passed away, his chief assistant, Cardinal, who was made a cardinal by Pope Francis before he died, he lived to, I think, 98, Cardinal Loris Capdevila. I had my great friend, Father Peter Gumpel, who has since gone to glory, God to the Lord, interview and write a letter to Loris Capdevila and asked him, did John the 23rd, who was known to have saved many Jews when he was the papal nuncio in Turkey and Greece, was he acting on his own or on behalf of Pius XII? Here is what his own lifelong assistant, Cardinal Capdevila, said about the action in favor of the Jews carried out particularly in Istanbul during the years 1935 to 1944, acknowledged and praised by the Jewish circles of Jerusalem, Istanbul, and the USA. It obliges one to concede that Roncalli, St. John the 23rd, was and declared himself executor of the intention and directions of Pope Pius XII. He respected the fact that the pontificate, that he himself was the eye, the ear, and mouth and heart of the charitable hand of Pope Pius XII. So just as Dr. X lays out brilliantly in his book, the Pope was working in coordinating with these heroic nuncios, many of whom have been declared righteous Gentiles by Yad Vashem. And now we have, more testimony from St. John the 23rd's own personal assistant. So I think the day will come. We are waiting for it, but we are hopeful. One day.
There were a couple of things that I've just brought to mind quickly that I want to mention. I don't know if you have the picture of 1941 B'nai B'rith magazine. Had a big picture of Shelley right on the front. I don't know if it's coming on the screen or not. But this was 1941 because when the Italians had the anti-Semitic laws, labor laws, the Vatican was hiring the Jews. And so the entire article, 1941, they're talking about the Pope's Jews, and they were hiring the Vatican Library, and they were working all throughout. And this is actually a fact. And there were so many different examples of things that have happened. But this is just another thing. And all the as I said, all the organizations loved him. What happened? Show me the smoking gun where 180 degrees changed.
It's a massive disinformation campaign, but there is nothing more indestructible than the truth. And the truth, I think it was Churchill said that the truth sometimes takes a while to get dressed up. But once it does, it shoots right to the top. So the truth about Pope Pius XII is making dramatic gains. They're stunned every time that we come out and we have conferences like this in Rome because they don't know, they just recycle the same things. It's the supporters of Pius XII. We're the ones who are coming out with all the new groundbreaking information. The critics, they just recycle the same old myths, but we're going to win this war.
There's also one other thing which is important. When Kristallnacht occurred, November 1938, 3 weeks after Kristallnacht, Pacelli, at that time, called the cardinals together and looked for 200,000 visas for non-Arian Catholics. Now that was a code word, as I pointed out before, to maintain neutrality. That's a code word for the Jews. There were exactly 217,000 Jews apparently left in Germany after Kristallnacht, and he had checked off all of the different nunciatures he tried to contact. And that was not that successful. I think they maybe got 1,000 visas and everything. But then soon after that, he writes another letter, another month later, where he's saying that we not just have to get visas for them to go, we must respect their religious convictions and so on. And when you say this about a Catholic, you don't have to say that, but these were converted Jews. And then there were letters, one letter from the Archbishop of Edinburgh, Scotland. And he writes back and he says that, he says, yes, we must do everything to help the poor persecuted Jews. He knew exactly what they were talking about. But the fact is that they had to act a certain way to protect their neutrality.
If the Nazis, and they sometimes did discover these documents, they were very dangerous.
Very dangerous.
In fact, lots of documents that could have shown even more evidence, were destroyed at the time because if the Nazis saw them, they would have arrested all the priests and perhaps the Pope himself. There was all sorts of threats against him for harboring Jews and for violating their impartiality. But in any event, so people don't understand, as Gary pointed out, and Sir Martin Gilbert told me as well, they have no idea how terrifying it is to live under a totalitarian regime where one misplaced word, one move can bring you instant execution. That's the kind of environment Pius XII was living under. And yet, in spite of that, he saved a tremendous amount of Jews along with all those heroes who worked with him.
We have time for a quick question. If anyone has a question.
Sure, would be the back row.
No, it's me, Gary.
Oh, okay. Professor.
This might be a very controversial question, but I was wondering if you could comment on the David Kurtzer book.
Oh.
Is it better or worse than Cornwall? Or
I would say, first of all, David Kurtzer wrote his first book, which won a Pulitzer Prize, which shows you the value of the Pulitzer Prize, completely provable. Just like The Deputy itself won a Tony Award when it appeared on Broadway, the show and everything. Yes, David Kurtzer attended this event that he was at.
Right.
In fact, he made statements in his book, which is provably wrong.
Okay.
And certain things, and again, this is, I think Johan can probably.
There is nothing to say. There was an official reaction on it from the Holy See, even.
Could you tell
because-
us about the book? I
What?
don't know David Kurtzer. Does everyone? Could you explain a little?
Well, it's difficult to explain. It's like,
Pius book?
well, he published a book like I did and others. If you don't read a book, you don't know what the book
The
is
book
about.
is, the
I was
book
wondering
is
if I should
found,
buy it.
But the only thing I can say that he one of the chapters is dedicated to a presumed concordats, let's say, negotiation between the German Reich and Hitler and the Pope just before the war broke out. So he says that he jumped on documents in our archives, historical archives, and that it are three different, let's say, missions of negotiations that comes to the Pope and from Germany to negotiate a new concordat. And that he says the Pope wants a new concordat. Now, it's very clear that when a Pope wants a new concordat for whatever country it would be, it is not the country that goes to the Pope. It is the nuncio in the country that goes to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs asking, let's say, motivated, a change of the concordat in that country. That's the first thing. So it is completely wrong putting this as the will of Pope Pius XII to change the concordat with Germany. And this is a little bit novelty, I think, bringing this out as a scoop, as a world scoop, on and blaming therefore Pius XII. I find that most inconvenient for a professor. Because he had, I don't know if he knows that, but he should know that as a professor of a Brown University, I mean, these are the ABC of our archives is that you know how diplomacy works, what it means, and more, even more, there is no new concordat at the end. So, what are you talking about? You are saying he wanted a new concordat, yes, but there wasn't, so he didn't want it at all, probably. You know? So, what are we talking about? About nothing, about air.
I would just say all professors are entitled to their views. I'm all for freedom of debate. I just think that we have an overwhelming case to answer them. There have been very good critiques of the book. L'Osservatore Romano, the Vatican's own newspaper, published one. My colleague, Professor Ron Rishlak, who published this book, Hitler, the War and the Pope. There's an excellent book called Church of Spies by Mark Reevely, who documents very heavily the Pope's direct involvement in the plots to overthrow Hitler, something that was almost, goes totally untreated or is dismissed.
We have to stick to the point. We have
Right.
to stick to someone whose statement is that there was an attempt to change the concordat, and saying this on the basis of these documents is nonsense.
Right. And
That is the thing. But the book is very well accepted and sold in the world, and of course everyone believes again that Pius XII wanted to collaborate with the Nazis, or he wanted to get from the Nazis something more for the Catholic Church, and was not seeing the sad fate of the Jews again.
Years ago, and I hope to update it, we published an entire anthology called The Pius War, Responses to the Critics of Pius XII. I think there's an enormous amount in that, in Dr. Ix's books, in the book by Mark Reebling, in so much that paved the way as document. And by all means, read Professor Kurtz's book, read all the other books, read Cornwell's book, read any book you want. Then come and read the books and the evidence that we have marshaled, and make up your own mind. I think that we have an overwhelmingly compelling case. That's what I've been told by many people who have read all these books together and seen the whole picture. I'm confident the truth will prevail.
Great. Craig wants to wind it up.
Yes.
We hope everybody learned something tonight. I think it's very, very important, because we are going to now just begin to see a crack in the dam. Because I know that Bill listened to all the testimony given in Rome at the Gregorian University and commented on a lot of it. And I think that's happening, is that a lot of these people realize they're like on a sinking ship, and they better start straightening themselves out. The fact is that a lot of these people have published everything. Understand what the problem is here. These are professors, PhDs in history and so on. They've published documents, they've made statements. It's on the internet. It doesn't go away. And how are you going to come back and say, I made a mistake? That would be the honorable thing to do, but they never, ever, ever do. They just don't do that.
Yeah, it's one of the most difficult things in the world is to admit that you're wrong, especially if you invested so much. Look, I look at my own church. I know that there have been scandals in the church. There have been great heroes. There have been wonderful, beautiful saints, but there's also been terrible scandals. I can't deny that those scandals existed. And if Pope Pius XII had did these terrible things, I'd have to be the first to say, my father, who was a lawyer, bless his soul, no longer living, he told me, Bill Jr., follow the facts wherever they lead. The facts lead me to believe overwhelmingly, based upon all the testimony I have heard, based upon all the documents I've seen, that Pope Pius XII was one of the great men of his age and of all time, and he did everything in his power, far more than most, to save and intervene the Jews and to battle Nazism from its very inception.
Yep. Thank you all for coming. We very much appreciate it. We'll probably get Vinny is going to help us get this on our website, right? Yeah. And we'll be able to review a lot of it. Sometimes it may sound a little confusing because we know things and we may be saying things you may not be familiar with, but just go through it and just try to take your time. And then I welcome everybody to come to our website and download the actual original documents. And I think you're going to find it quite fascinating. This is really...
Thank you all for believing and searching for the truth. To search for the truth is to really search for God. Thank you. God bless you all.